They laughed when I left broke, they went silent when I returned rich. They laughed at my fall. Ethan Cole stood in the middle of the glass office, his hands steady but his heart beating louder than the silence around him, the kind of silence that comes before something breaks, and he could feel it, the shift, the moment his life was about to turn in a direction he never expected, because just hours ago he was the man everyone respected, the one people greeted with forced smiles and careful words, but now those same faces looked different, colder, sharper, almost amused, and that was when Victor Langston leaned back in his chair with a slow clap, a sound that echoed through the room like mockery dressed as applause, and then came the laughter, not loud at first, just a few chuckles from the corners, but it spread quickly, growing into something heavier, something cruel, until the entire room felt like it was closing in on Ethan, and in that moment he understood something painful. Respect had never been real. It had only been rented, and now that he had nothing, they had taken it back without hesitation. Victor stood up, adjusting his expensive suit like he had just won something important, and looked Ethan straight in the eye with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that said everything without saying anything. "You're finished." And then he spoke, his voice calm but cutting, telling Ethan that the company no longer needed him, that his position had been terminated effective immediately, that security would escort him out, and just like that, years of loyalty were reduced to a few cold sentences. Ethan didn't argue, he didn't beg, he didn't lower himself to give them the satisfaction, but inside, something cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for him to feel the weight of it, because losing a job is one thing, but losing your dignity in front of people who once pretended to respect you is something else entirely. And as he turned to leave, he heard it again, the laughter, louder this time, more confident, like they were celebrating his fall. Jason Miller leaned over to someone and whispered something that made them both laugh harder. Olivia Grant looked away, uncomfortable but silent, and Victor simply watched, enjoying every second of it, and Ethan kept walking, each step heavier than the last, until he reached the elevator. And when the doors closed, the laughter finally disappeared, replaced by a silence that felt even louder. And that was when he allowed himself to breathe, to feel, to process what had just happened, because moments like that don't just pass, they stay, they settle deep inside you, and they either break you or they build something stronger. But at that moment Ethan didn't know which one it would be. All he knew was that everything had changed. When he stepped outside the building, the city moved on like nothing had happened, cars passing, people rushing, life continuing without pause, and that was the hardest part, realizing that your worst moment is just another ordinary day for everyone else. He stood there for a second, looking back at the tall glass building that once felt like a symbol of his success, and now looked like a place he no longer belonged to, and he could almost hear their laughter still echoing from inside, reminding him of exactly where he stood in their eyes, at the bottom, forgotten, dismissed, and underestimated. And maybe that was what hurt the most, not the job, not the money, but the way they saw him, like he was nothing, like he had always been nothing. And as he walked away, something shifted inside him, not a sudden burst of motivation, not some dramatic promise of revenge, just a quiet, steady realization that this was not the end of his story, even if they believed it was. And if you've ever been in a moment like that, where people laugh at your lowest point, where they think your story is over, then you already know how this feels. And you already know why stories like this matter, because sometimes the greatest comebacks begin in silence, not with noise, not with announcements, but with a decision that no one else sees. And right now, Ethan was standing at that exact point, the beginning of something no one in that office could even imagine. So if you want to see what happens next, if you believe in proving people wrong, if you've ever been underestimated, then this story is for you. Make sure you subscribe, hit that subscribe button, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this is only chapter 1, and trust me, when Ethan returns, they won't be laughing anymore. The lowest point the first night after everything fell apart was the hardest, not because Ethan Cole did not have a place to sleep, but because for the first time in years, he had nowhere to go in the morning, no meetings, no emails, no calls waiting for him, just silence. And that silence felt louder than the laughter he had left behind in that office. It followed him home, sat with him in the dark, and reminded him that his life had changed in a single moment. He dropped his keys on the table and looked around his apartment, a place that once felt like a reward for his hard work, but now felt temporary, fragile, like something he could lose next. He sat down slowly, staring at nothing, replaying every second of that room in his head, Victor's smile, the clapping, The laughter, the way no one stood up for him, and the more he thought about it, the heavier it became, because it was not just about losing his job, it was about realizing that the respect he thought he had earned was never real, it was borrowed, and now it was gone. The next morning came without purpose. Ethan woke up early out of habit, his body still trained for a life that no longer existed. He reached for his phone expecting notifications, but there was nothing. Just a blank screen reflecting back a version of himself he barely recognized. He got up anyway, trying to hold on to some routine, but every small action felt pointless, like he was pretending to still be someone he was not anymore. Days passed like this, slow and heavy, each one blending into the next. He started sending out applications, updating his resume, reaching out to contacts, but the responses were cold, delayed, or did not come at all, and with every rejection, the voice in his head grew louder, the same voice that echoed the laughter from that room, telling him maybe they were right, maybe he was not as valuable as he thought, maybe he had already reached his peak, and now he was just falling, one step at a time. His savings started to matter in a way they never had before. Every expense became a decision, every purchase a question. How long can you last? He cut back on everything, the small comforts, the things he once did without thinking, and even then, the pressure did not leave, it stayed, sitting on his chest every night when he tried to sleep, reminding him that time was moving whether he was ready or not. One afternoon, he ran into Jason Miller by accident, the same colleague who had laughed the loudest. Jason looked surprised at first, then quickly recovered with a smile that felt fake, asking Ethan how things were going, but there was something in his tone, something that suggested he already knew the answer. Ethan kept it short, said he was working on new opportunities, trying to keep his dignity intact, but Jason nodded in a way that made it clear he did not believe him, and as they parted ways, Ethan felt that same familiar weight settle back in, the feeling of being seen as less, of being judged without being understood. That night was different, not because things got better, but because something inside him reached a breaking point. He sat in the dark again, the city lights faint through the window, and for the first time, he allowed himself to fully feel it, the frustration, the anger, the disappointment, not just in them, but in himself, for trusting, for believing, for not seeing it sooner, and it hurt, it really did, but there was something else there too, something quieter, something that did not match the chaos in his mind, a question, simple but powerful. What if this is not the end? What if this is the beginning? He did not answer it right away, because doubt was still strong, louder than anything else, but the question stayed, repeating itself in the background, refusing to disappear. The next day, he woke up with that same question still there, and for the first time in days, he did something different. He stopped waiting, he stopped refreshing his email, stopped hoping for someone else to give him an opportunity, and instead, he picked up a notebook and started writing, not plans, not perfect ideas, just thoughts, skills he had, things he could build, problems he knew how to solve. It was messy, unorganized, but it was a start, and sometimes, that is all you need, a start. Something small that moves you forward even when everything else feels stuck. Hours passed without him noticing, and for the first time since that day in the office, he felt something shift, not success, not confidence, but control. A small piece of it, enough to remind him that his story was still in his hands, even if it did not feel like it before. Outside, nothing had changed, the same city, the same noise, the same people moving on with their lives. But inside, something was different. The lowest point had shown him something he could not ignore anymore, that no one was coming to save him, no one was going to hand him back the respect he lost, and if he wanted to change anything, he would have to do it himself, quietly, patiently, without the world watching, because the same people who laughed would not see what was coming, not yet, and maybe that was exactly how it needed to be, because sometimes the strongest growth happens in silence, far away from the eyes that once doubted you. And as Ethan closed his notebook that night, he did not feel victorious, he did not feel powerful, but he felt something real, something steady, a decision forming, not loud, not dramatic, but strong enough to carry him forward, one step at a time, into a future no one else could predict, especially not the ones who had already decided his story was over. The silent transformation, the change did not happen in one moment. It did not arrive with a sudden breakthrough or a perfect idea. It came slowly, quietly, in the small decisions Ethan Cole made every single day when no one was watching, when the world had already moved on from him and the people who once laughed had stopped thinking about him completely. And maybe that was the most powerful part of it, because now there was no pressure to impress anyone, No need to prove anything immediately, just time, discipline, and a growing determination that refused to fade. Ethan started waking up earlier than before, not because he had somewhere to be, but because he had something to build. He created a routine, simple but strict. Mornings were for learning, afternoons for building, nights for reviewing everything he had done. And at first, it felt slow, almost pointless, like he was putting in effort without seeing results. But he kept going, because he understood something now that he had ignored before: consistency matters more than motivation. And motivation fades quickly when things get hard. The first few weeks tested him in ways he did not expect. There were moments when doubt came back stronger than ever, whispering that none of this would work, that he was wasting time, that maybe he should just go back and try to fit into the same system that had already rejected him. But every time that thought appeared, he remembered the laughter, not to hurt himself, but to remind himself why he could not go back. Why going back would mean accepting the version of himself they believed in, the one that could be dismissed and forgotten, and he refused to be that person again. So he kept moving forward, one task at a time, one improvement at a time, slowly turning his skills into something sharper, something more valuable. He started working on a project, something he had thought about for years but never had the time or courage to pursue. It was risky, uncertain, and there were no guarantees it would succeed, but it was his, completely his. And that made all the difference. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and while nothing looked dramatic from the outside, everything was changing on the inside. His thinking became clearer, his focus stronger, his confidence quieter but more real. He stopped seeking validation, stopped comparing himself to others, because he no longer needed to be seen to believe in what he was doing, and that shift changed everything. There were still struggles, moments when progress felt invisible, when results did not match effort, when exhaustion made him question everything again. But this time, he did not stop. He had learned how to sit with discomfort without letting it control him, how to keep going even when there was no immediate reward. And that is where most people quit. But Ethan did not, because he knew something they did not: that transformation is not loud, it does not announce itself, it happens quietly, beneath the surface, until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. One evening, as he reviewed his work, he noticed something different, something small but undeniable. He was no longer the same person who had walked out of that office months ago. The fear that once controlled him had been replaced with something steadier, something stronger, a belief built on action, not words. And for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge it, not as pride, but as proof that he was moving in the right direction, that his efforts were not wasted, that the version of himself he was becoming could not be laughed at so easily. Opportunities began to appear, not because he chased them desperately, but because he had built something worth noticing. People started responding differently, conversations changed, doors that once felt closed began to open slightly, and even though nothing had fully happened yet, Ethan could feel it, the shift, the momentum building quietly, preparing for something bigger. But he did not rush it. He did not try to force results before their time. He stayed patient, focused, committed to the process that had brought him this far, because he understood that rushing now could destroy everything he had built in silence, and silence had become his greatest advantage, because while others were busy talking, comparing, and seeking attention, he was building something real, something solid, something that did not depend on anyone else's approval, and that difference would soon become visible to everyone, especially the ones who had already decided his story was over. Late one night, Ethan stood by his window, looking out at the same city that once felt overwhelming, and for the first time, it felt different, not because the city had changed, but because he was no longer looking at it as someone trying to survive, but as someone preparing to step back into it with purpose, with control, with a quiet confidence that did not need to be announced. And in that moment, he realized something important. The return was coming, not as revenge driven by anger, but as a result of growth, discipline, and patience. And when that moment arrived, it would not just silence the laughter, it would redefine how they saw him completely. But until then, he would keep going, keep building, keep transforming in silence, because the most powerful comebacks are not the ones that are rushed, they are the ones that are earned, step by step, in moments no one else sees. And Ethan was closer than ever to showing the world exactly what that looked like. The return. The morning Ethan Cole decided to return did not feel loud or dramatic, it felt calm, controlled, almost ordinary. And that was the difference between who he used to be and who he had become, because before he needed recognition, he needed people to see his value. but now he understood something deeper. Real power does not need to announce itself, it shows up quietly and lets results speak. He stood in front of the same building he once walked out of with nothing but silence and laughter behind him, but this time, he was not the same man. His posture was different, his mind was clear, and his presence carried something that could not be ignored, not arrogance, not anger, but certainty, the kind of certainty built through months of discipline, failure, growth, and silent work. As he stepped inside, the familiar environment felt smaller than he remembered, like the place had not grown but he had. People moved around as usual, conversations, footsteps, the low hum of business continuing without pause, but then something subtle happened. Heads started turning, not all at once, but one by one, like a quiet ripple spreading through the room, recognition mixed with confusion, because they remembered him, but they did not recognize the version of him standing there now. Jason Miller was the first to react, his expression shifting from surprise to uncertainty as Ethan walked past him without slowing down, without acknowledging him. And that alone said more than any words could, because before, Ethan would have tried to prove something, would have looked for validation, but now, he had nothing to prove to anyone in that room. He walked with purpose, straight toward the same conference room where everything had fallen apart, and when he reached the door, he paused for just a second, not out of fear, but out of awareness. This was the exact place where his lowest moment had been witnessed, where the laughter had filled the air, where he had been dismissed like he meant nothing. And now he was about to step back into it, but this time, everything was different. Inside, the meeting had already started, voices filled the room, familiar faces seated around the table, and at the head of it all was Victor Langston, still confident, still composed, still believing he was in control, but that belief was about to be tested. Ethan opened the door and stepped in, and just like that, the room fell silent, not gradually, not partially, completely, as if the air itself had been pulled out. Every eye turned toward him, some shocked, some confused, some unsure of what this meant, but none of them were laughing, not anymore. Victor's expression changed in a way Ethan had never seen before. The confidence was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, something unfamiliar, uncertainty, because this was not the same man he had dismissed months ago. This was someone else entirely, someone who walked in without hesitation, without asking for permission, without needing approval. Ethan did not rush, he did not speak immediately, he simply stepped forward and placed a file on the table, the sound echoing in the silence. And then he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the same people who once watched him fall, but this time, they were not looking down at him, they were looking at him, trying to understand what had changed, trying to catch up to something they did not see coming. Victor leaned forward, attempting to regain control of the moment, asking Ethan what this was, his tone still firm but no longer as certain as before, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, and clear, explaining that he was no longer there as an employee, not as someone seeking approval or asking for a second chance, but as someone who had built something of his own, something valuable enough to stand in that room as an equal, not beneath them, not above them, but beyond the version they once defined him as. He explained the project, the growth, the results, not with excitement, not with arrogance, but with confidence backed by proof, and as he spoke, the energy in the room shifted. The same people who once laughed were now listening, carefully, seriously, because they could feel it. This was real, this was not an attempt to impress, this was the outcome of something they had underestimated completely. Jason avoided eye contact, Olivia watched closely, and Victor, for the first time, did not interrupt, because he understood something had changed, not just in Ethan, but in the situation itself. The balance of power was no longer where he thought it was, and that realization settled in slowly but heavily. Ethan finished speaking and stepped back slightly, not waiting for applause, not expecting validation, because he did not need it. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not filled with mockery, it was filled with thought, with realization, with the quiet understanding that the man they once laughed at had returned as someone they could no longer ignore. And in that moment, Ethan realized something important. This was not about revenge, not about making them feel small the way they had made him feel. It was about showing what was possible when someone refuses to stay in the place others put them in. And as he stood there, calm and composed, he knew this was only the beginning of something bigger, because the return was not just about proving them wrong. It was about stepping into a version of himself that no one in that room had ever seen before. And as the meeting slowly resumed, with a different tone, a different energy, Ethan did not look back, because he no longer needed to. The laughter was gone, replaced by something far more powerful, respect earned in silence and revealed in one undeniable moment they stopped laughing. The silence in that room did not break quickly, it stretched, heavy and undeniable, settling into every corner like a truth no one could escape, and Ethan Cole stood in the center of it, calm, grounded, no longer the man who once walked out carrying doubt and humiliation, but someone entirely different. Someone who had faced the lowest point and rebuilt himself piece by piece without asking anyone for permission. Victor Langston was the first to move, shifting in his chair, trying to regain the control that had once come so easily to him. But it was different now, because control cannot survive where certainty has been replaced by doubt, and Ethan could see it clearly, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that called attention, but in the small details, the hesitation before Victor spoke, the way his voice lacked the sharp confidence it once carried, and when he finally did speak, asking questions about Ethan's project, about the numbers, about the structure, it was no longer from a place of authority, it was from a place of caution, even curiosity. And that was the moment everything truly shifted, because the same man who once dismissed him without a second thought was now trying to understand him, trying to catch up to something he had failed to see before. Ethan answered calmly, clearly, not rushing, not over-explaining, just presenting facts, results, and vision, and with every word, the room leaned in more. The attention that once came from position and title was now coming from respect, earned through action, not given by status. Jason Miller sat quietly, avoiding the eyes of others. The same person who had laughed now had nothing to say, and Olivia Grant, who once stayed silent out of uncertainty, now watched Ethan with a different expression, one that reflected recognition, not of who he was before, but of who he had become. And as the conversation continued, something unexpected happened. The tone of the room shifted from observation to opportunity. Questions turned into interest, interest turned into discussion, and discussion began to open doors that had once been closed, not because Ethan asked for them, but because his work demanded it. And that is the difference most people never understand. When you build something real, something valuable, you do not need to chase validation. It comes to you, quietly, naturally, because it cannot be ignored. Victor leaned back again, but this time there was no clapping, no smirk, no hidden mockery, just silence and thought. And when he finally spoke, it was different, offering collaboration, suggesting partnership, trying to position himself on the side of something he had once rejected. And Ethan listened, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this was not about proving a point anymore. It was about choosing what aligned with the person he had become. And that is a power no one can take from you, the power to choose your next step without being influenced by the opinions that once defined you. He responded respectfully, professionally, but firmly, making it clear that he was not there to return to what he once was. He was there to move forward, to expand, to build something greater on his own terms. And that answer settled into the room like a final statement, not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. The meeting eventually came to an end, but the energy did not disappear. It followed Ethan as he stood, as he gathered his things, as he walked toward the door, the same door he had once walked through carrying the weight of failure. And this time, as he reached it, he paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. This was the full circle, the point where everything connected, the fall, the struggle, the silent work, and now the return. And as he stepped out, the difference was undeniable. No laughter followed him, no whispers filled the air, only silence and eyes that watched with a new understanding. And as he walked through the office, the same people who once overlooked him now stepped aside, not because they were told to, but because they felt it, the shift, the presence, the quiet authority that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you have built. Outside, the city looked the same, just as it had the day he lost everything. But this time, it felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had. And that is where the real victory lies, not in the reaction of others, not in the silence of those who once laughed, but in the transformation that no one can take away from you. Ethan stopped for a moment, looking up at the building one last time, and there was no anger left, no need for revenge, just a clear understanding that some chapters are meant to end so better ones can begin. And as he turned and walked away, he did not carry the past with him. He carried the lessons, the growth, and the certainty that whatever came next would be built on something real, something strong, something that could not be taken away by anyone's opinion. And if you have ever been in a place where people laughed at you, where they doubted you, where they thought your story was over, let this remind you that the ending is yours to decide, not theirs. So if this story inspired you, if you believe in rising stronger, in proving people wrong through action, make sure you hit the subscribe button, like this video, share it with someone who needs this message, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, because your story is not over, it is just getting started. And just like Ethan, one day, they will stop laughing.